Thank you.
We'll take a short break now for something slightly related, but completely different. Do stay with us.
Well, I did say that we're talking about something quite related, but totally different. Well, related in the fact, in the area where you've heard subsidy already being mentioned there, in the electricity sector, we did hear that about 30 billion naira being used to subsidize the electricity sector will soon be withdrawn by the federal government. And if you remember, if you cast your minds back to what the papers were reporting this morning, some of the headlines already had that there was going to be another system grid collapse, and as a result, blackouts are expected. What needs to be done in the electricity sector to get it up and running at a level that delivers service, at least service that a lot of Nigerians are satisfied with to the populace? Joining us this morning to talk about it is Mr. Ayodele Oni, who's an energy lawyer. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I'm sure that you must have seen the dailies this morning. I don't know if you saw any of them. I hope that you have. A lot of them talking about how our system is about to collapse again, or maybe has already collapsed, and as such, we're expecting another blackout. And then you also saw the headline about 30 billion naira in subsidies about to be withdrawn. I don't know which one of them has given you the biggest headache. Do you think that the move by the federal government to withdraw subsidies from the electricity sector is a wise move? Will it really lead to more efficiency in that sector?
It depends on how you look at it. Ultimately, subsidy shouldn't be forever. It's something that should be in place for a period of time. As long as you've got efficiency in the market, as long as every player does play its role efficiently. Now, in terms of subsidy, usually you would have subsidy when you have underpricing, when the actual value of a product or a service, when people underpay for that product or service, someone then needs to top it off or top it up, as it were. So that's what we've had in the power sector. We've had two types of subsidies in the sector. We've had cross-subsidy, where the maximum demand customers cross-subsidize the much smaller consumers, and where you have government also top up. For the past 7-8 years, you speak of 30 billion. The government has spent about 1.7 trillion on subsidies in the power sector. So at some point, it would be difficult to continue to afford that. Rather, those sums should be used to ensure efficiency, to support metering, similar to what government is doing around the national mass metering program. That seems to be making some progress, unlike what we had with the CAPME and the meter asset providers regime. So I think it wouldn't stay forever. It's a situation where people see electricity as a social service, where you pay almost nothing for that service. And it shouldn't be. Everywhere else in the world where we all want to go to on holiday or want to live, they pay for electricity, and you pay commercially for electricity. You just need to be efficient in your use of electricity. Find cheaper means, rather than use incandescent lamps, use fluorescent lamps, use LEDs. That's the way people reduce electricity use. That's it. Subsidy is not sustainable.
So for you support this move on the part of government to withdraw the support that they have long given. I know that you've tried to, enumerate the numerous ways that the subsidies have come in, and I know that a number of consumers will be saying, which subsidy? We are paying, humongous amounts of monies on electricity supply, at least electricity that we get, and you did mention some customers who are currently subsidizing some other consumers. But if you look at what is happening at the upstream sector, the gas end of the generators, they say that, it would seem that they have benefited the most from this subsidy regime. And I know that they usually do not like the word benefit, but it would seem that that's where a lot of government subsidies have gone to. I don't know what your thoughts are. How do you think that is going to affect that particular sector? Because they have been complaining for some time that they rarely get remittances from the downstream sector, that's the distributors now, who are supposed to mop up these monies and pay the generators. So what do you think will happen at that end?
Okay, it's interesting to mention this point first. Gradually, we are moving to service reflectivity such that tariffs will match the quality of service you receive. Now, for government, as the policy is to have bands, and that's what currently operates, such that you have different bands of consumers. For those consumers who receive good quality service up to 20, there's up to 20 hours and there's up to 16 hours. They actually pay what is much more cost reflective than everyone else. So the intention is to gradually ensure that everyone falls within those two bands, particularly bands A and B. Now, the idea behind electricity tariffs is such that inputs such as gas get paid for also. Gas is supposed to be a pass-through. As long as gas is a pass-through, then there should be no problem with the upstream guys. The problem always has been that there is subsidy because prices are not cost reflective. You imagine you produce something for 2 naira and you are forced to sell it for 50 kobo. Someone has to pay that difference for you to be able to break even and then make a profit. So the intention is gradually government intends by the end of this year to phase out issues around subsidy and to ensure that it's cost reflective. You imagine that you would only buy what you can afford. So those discos will take electricity that they are able to distribute and collect. Because the idea has always been, and the key problem is at the technical, commercial, and collection risk. People always forget that point. That's the key challenge. As long as we do have that challenge, as long as electricity tariffs are not cost reflective, you would continue to subsidize. But once they become cost reflective and service reflective, which is where we are currently, and it's improving by the day, then the issue of subsidy with time would become irrelevant. So with time, I expect that it continues to reduce as government has sought to do, because more and more consumers are paying cost and service reflective tariffs.
So what do we make of this blackout story now? When there are threats that the national grid is about to collapse as a result of whatever it is that's happening in that particular sector. But these are downtimes that usually also have an effect. How do you think that areas like this will be accounted for in this current regime that we're currently in, this service reflective regime? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so that's an interesting point. Recall that metering is to provide both a carrot and a stick. When you have electricity, then you pay for electricity. When there is then no electricity, then you do not pay. That's one angle. With respect to activities being undertaken by government, you may be aware that quite a bit is happening across the value chain. There is the Transmission Expansion and Rehabilitation Program. And recently, I think it's the African Development Bank did release some funds. Now, one thing is that over time, and between 1987, I think the last time we had a substantial grid enhancement before privatization was 1987. Imagine what the population was between 1987 and 2013. the increase must have been substantial. So it's still a lot of people relying on the same old infrastructure. Now, part of what government is looking to do around transmission is the SCADA, this supervisory control and data acquisition. It's technology that ensures that you can detect these problems ahead of time. There are several reasons for the grid collapse. You know, technical reasons, volume of power, imbalances, issues around the system operation. Now, once we can properly, and government is doing quite a bit around those, around system operation, once we can successfully improve on the technology, and that's being done, you will see that will reduce substantially. And I dare say it's reduced substantially compared to what we did have last year. It's improved. What we had last year, what we had the year before. I think we've had only 2 so far this year compared to what we've had historically. So I know it's easy to lose faith in the system. It's easy to get despondent, but I think that quite a bit is happening. We are not seeing all of the results, but you can, I'm sure many people can confirm that it's improved, even if marginally where they stay. So that's part of the reasons why metering is important. You pay for electricity only when you do take electricity, and everyone has a role to play. Consumers, the government, and the investors in the sector. So if we do have those problems around the grid, it then means that you then don't pay. Unlike a system where you had estimated billing where everybody does pay. Now, one thing that I think can also help, and which the Rural Electrification Agency is doing quite a bit, is having mini grids, distributed generation, so that you take a lot of people off the grid, particularly in rural areas and in areas where it's not commercially viable to extend the grid. And I've been to places in the north where, in certain places where they have mini grids, they have better quality electricity and for longer hours than even in urban areas. So I think we need to continue to push a strategy of both off-grid and on-grid supply. I think that's one way out of the quagmire we currently find ourselves.
So I wanted to know, when you talk about, I mean, the reason I'm asking you the question about blackouts is because oftentimes the GenCos are still working when there is a national blackout. It's just that the consumers are not getting the electricity, maybe as a result of what has happened at transmission. The DISCOs will always say that, well, they are ready to collect power whenever it is that they are supplied. So the question is, who then pays for the GenCos who are still, you know, churning out power, so to speak, even though the consumers were not getting it, and as such, we're not consuming anything which was already, you know, put on their meters. How do you think that gap is going to be filled if this sort of thing continues? You say we've only had 2 this year, but people will say we're still mid-year. It's the first half, or we're still at the beginning of the first half of the year. We still have at least another 6 months or thereabout, maybe 5 months to go to the end of the year. If we have, say, another 3 or 4, and we don't know how long this blackouts is supposed to last for, who pays when there is a blackout? Who pays the GenCos when there is a blackout?
Okay, interestingly, there are rules around those now, very interestingly, and it's the transmission company. There is the carrot and stick approach. So when some of these happen, depending on which fault it is, there's a regime for payment. There's a regime for penalties. So where it's the fault of the transmission company does pay certain penalties. And in other circumstances where you've got distribution companies refusing to accept electricity, then to accept load, then it's the distribution company that pays. So in this instance, it generally will be the transmission company. But the point I was trying to make around issues with the grid is that a lot is currently being done to ensure that that incidence reduces drastically. So that's the response. There is a regime that states who's responsible and who does pay for these inefficiencies.
Well, just to be clear, Mr. Oni, because I mean, when you talk about subsidy, a number of questions, so many people will be asking it, okay, in the electricity sector, who is getting it? So at what stage has Nigeria been subsidizing electricity over the years? Yeah, the distribution level, the transmission level, or the generation level?
Okay, it's been across board, to be honest, because recall that the distribution companies are supposed to collect and then distribute across the value chain. So the electricity firm, the distribution companies collect from you and I, collect from factories, then pay the transmission company, which provides wheeling services, pays the generation company, the market, of course, working with the market operator. So it's across the value chain. Once you subsidize the distribution companies, you are indirectly subsidizing everybody else who is a market participant, because there is then the settlement. So it's across the value chain, even up to gas, because you do need, I mean, much of our generation is gas fired. So if you will subsidize the distribution companies, you will inextricably be also subsidizing gas supply. It's across the value chain.
So one of the challenges, one of the things that one of the challenges that has been, mentioned several times in the electricity sector has been that the weakest link in the entire value chain so far has been the discos, and the challenge has been that of being able to collect enough revenue to be able to feed the gencos, or rather pay for what they receive from the generating companies. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand is the fact that the gencos are there to make money. And there is that complaint from Nigerians that how can Nigeria be exporting electricity when we do not have enough? Meanwhile, the gencos will tell you that the discos have to request before they can generate. There's a lot of things that so many people don't understand in all of this. And then this blackout, people always have issues with it. So I'm just wondering, it would seem like we do not have a concurrence between the gencos, the trancos, and the discos about just how much power needs to be generated per time. What we need is clear, but what we are able to generate, transmit, and distribute, that's another thing altogether. Exactly what do we need to do? What's been missing over the years? How come we do not have all over the nation giving electricity as and when? It is definitely affecting productivity, you would agree?
Yeah. Okay. It's Hydra-headed. And I'll take it a bit historical. When you speak to the discos not accepting power, I'd say 3 factors. 1, the tariffs. 2, the equipment. And 3, the consumers. This is what plays out. A generation company wants to supply you electricity at a particular feeder point, but you understand that the consumers in that area do not like to pay. Or even before you get to the consumers, your infrastructure is poor, you can't accept all of that power. That's one problem. Where you can even accept it, you realize that the consumers are unlikely to pay. But you have loans you need to service. You have obligations you need to meet. Then you estimate billing. You go to an area where people are likely to pay. You divide that money by the amount you want to make, by the number of consumers in that area, and you have crazy invoices. That's what happens. It's Hydra-headed. It's not one aspect of the value chain. That's why you also hear issues around stranded capacity. Because when you generate, recall that it's not usually generation then distribution. You generate, there's transmission before you reach the distribution end. If there's a problem, and for every system, for every chain or value chain, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Once there's a problem across or within any of those segments, it would affect the cross-section. So if you have issues with transmission, then you'd have stranded capacity. A lot of generation, I always say generation isn't our problem. It isn't our problem because if consumers can pay, if the transmission company can will sufficient power, and the distribution company have good infrastructure, and you and I are willing to pay, then the generation companies will be able to generate more than sufficient power. So that's what the problem is. At some point, it was cost reflectivity that was a problem. you had issues with consumers not wanting to pay, and then you had poor equipment. Now, you would say, if you recall the privatization, the basis for privatization, privatizing the discos was how they were going to reduce the aggregate technical, commercial, and collection risks, losses. That's the basis, not necessarily what they were going to pay for those assets. Now, so promises were made, and some of those promises were not kept. Also because, one, they would argue that government didn't keep some of its promises around enhancing the grid. And secondly, they would say they were not able to conduct their due diligence effectively because of labor issues. And the baseline, the basis for buying or for making those promises are faulty or were faulty at that time. So it's across the value chain, from transmission not being able to wheel sufficient to distribution companies. Maybe when some of those were bought, they were even over leveraged, such that you've borrowed so much to be able to buy an asset, and you need to spend much more to put it in the right shape, and you don't have that money. That's why, unlike what we've had before, and that's where I see improvement with what this current administration is doing. We seem to, in the past, just throw money at the problem. Now there's a lot of performance monitoring. As the discos and as they get loans, their milestone payments, those payments are based on what you've been able to achieve, and you have third parties or third-party companies coming to verify. So I think that despite the way it seems, progress is being made. I mean, at times when you make progress, it's not obvious. Like building a house, it looks a bit funny initially, but as you move along, then things improve. So it's a problem across the value chain, even from gas, commercial issues around the gas sector. So once you've got a challenge across, and it's been mostly commercial and technical, really, and whether consumers want to pay. That's why government policy had to change from cost reflectivity, strictly speaking, to service reflectivity, such that you pay what you ought to pay as long as that service is high quality. And if the discos don't fulfill their obligations, then they'd have to refund. There's even that requirement to refund. If you're supposed to be getting 20 hours per day, and that's what you pay for, and you end up getting 16 hours or 12 hours, then there will be a refund. So all of those have been put in place. It's just having the regulators enforce more. So, well, also okay.
My apologies. If you know, all of these things, service reflective, cost reflective, at the end of the day, it's the consumer that's at the receiving end. You keep saying that, you know, sometimes the consumer does not want to pay. But then there is that instruction, or I don't know what else to call it, that the president said every home should be metered as quickly as possible. As a matter of fact, I think about just a few months ago, the NERC, while they were contemplating, you know, an increment in the electricity tariff, they said that all discos should first of all meter the customers, have conversations with them before even considering an increment in the service tariff that they are going to send out. As we speak, not all homes are metered. And if we are going to say that people are not willing to pay, shouldn't we first of all give them the reason to? I mean, reference the telecom sector, for instance. People want to use phones. If you do not have credit on your phone, you can't make a call. Prepaid, postpaid, whichever one is your choice. So if people do not have the facilities, the technology that they need to do the needful, what then are they supposed to do? At the end of the day, it is business for the disco. So we can't say, I don't think anyone would agree with you that the consumer does not want to pay. Yes, there is what you call electricity theft, but the fact that they do not want to pay shouldn't be the fault of nobody wants to release money, but if they are offering service as and when due, why shouldn't they want to pay?
Okay, recall my analysis was historical. I'm not saying it's necessarily always the case that everyone doesn't want to pay, or most of the people don't want to pay. So you're right. And I said a few things. One of those issues is around data. I think we need to do more with data in terms of the gap in metering. I think it keeps changing. You hear it's 6 million, you hear it's 10 million. So with government's current policy on mass metering, I think with time that will change. But you also need to be aware that there are people who go out of their way to ensure that they do not receive those meters. And those are those who, and you think that number is very small, but I dare say it isn't. There are a lot of people who think I'd rather have arrangements with employees of those distribution companies than pay what I ought to pay. So it's a combination of several
for
factors.
Meters,
so
just
yes,
a second. There are those who have applied for meters, and as we speak, they still don't have them. So why don't we even give to those who are willing first? I believe that one way or the other would increase the income for discos to be able to do the needful. The figures you say, they are still going to be there, but eventually, if everyone who is supposed to be metered were to be metered, I don't think that number will be significant.
Oh, yes, you're right. There's a process for that, and that's ongoing. And I think it's also enlightenment. People need to know that these are their rights. Like under that government policy, it's in two phases. We're currently in phase 0, then there's phase 1. Initially, it's 1 million. It's not, you have to also balance government income, revenues, cost, borrowing with all of this. If many of these policies had succeeded before now, we won't be having this conversation. But quite often, many government policies seem to fail, and it's the human angle to it. But in this case, you would see that there's quite a lot of progress. But it's never a perfect situation. So people who have not received can reach out to the discos and keep NERC in copy. There's that option. There are available means and media for you to complain when you've paid and you've not received your meters. And it's a very valid point that metering is critical. And metering is even critical to reduce electricity theft and to ensure that people actually pay for only what they use. So I agree with you completely.
Yeah. It's interesting, the part you say where that your government policies fail because of the human angle. And I hope that the human angle will also be able to ameliorate, the problem created thereby. But for now, we have to thank you very much for being a part of this conversation. Ayodele Oni is an energy lawyer. Thank you very much for your time and your thoughts this morning.